So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon for the third in the series of our transitioning to ISO 15189 support hubs. It's lovely to have you all alongside this afternoon. We've already done a couple. We've done the very first gap analysis meeting with the lovely Al a few weeks and months back, and then we did a second one both with UCASA assessors and some technical assessors as well as part of that call. And for those of you that haven't had the opportunity to join for those, they are available through the IBMS website, so you can go back and listen to our dulcet tones one more time if you're really interested. Today, however, we're going to do point of care testing. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Debra Padgett. I'm Clinical Pathology Service Manager in Northumbria, and I am also IBMS past president. And for my sins, I was also a quality manager in recent history, which is why I chair the IBMS quality panel. Alongside us today, you've already seen his lovely face. We have John, who's Senior Assessment Manager with UCAS, and who is resident point of care expert for UCAS as well. So he's going to support this afternoon. We're going to go through a couple of different parts for you. First and foremost, we're just going to do a little bit on the transition to date. We've started every session with that so far. It's a really good opportunity to hear from UCAS and our assessment managers around some of the challenges that we've seen on the ground from the transition, and share some of that learning as part of your preparation as we transition across to the 2022 standards of 15189. And then after that, we're going to hone in and focus really on 15189 for point of care testing and transitioning away from 22870. And I'm sure John will give us a run through on some of the exciting things that there are. There'll be an opportunity after all of that for you to ask questions. Please, please, please make the most of either the chat function or the Q&A function so that we get the most out of the session. I'm sure John is ready and willing to answer as many questions as possible. And we also have some of our members from the Quality Specialty Advisory Group as well, who are also on hand to be able to answer our questions and support as much as possible as we go through today. If we get through all of that, I do have a little bit of an update on where we're at from the national point of care side. So both from the Institute side and the document that we produced in conjunction with RCPath and ALM, but also kind of the recent NHS view, and I appreciate that's specific to England, but there's key learning across all of the home nations. So if we get a chance to do that, I'll run through just a few slides on that for you later on this afternoon. But in the first instance, and with no further ado, John, would you like to rejoin me on the screen? I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to let you share your slide deck, and we'll go first bit first. And can we just have a bit of an update on how transition to the new standard is going from a UCAS point of view? Thanks.
Okay, so another IT snag, although I can switch my camera on and switch my mic on, the share screen, it's just coming up with a message saying only meeting organisers and presenters can share, but I cannot share.
Okie dokie, give me 30 seconds. Let's see. Right. Have another go now.
Okay. We are in business. Excellent.
See, just like that.
Okay. So if I do a little bit of juggling around on my screen, hopefully everyone can see that slide deck now.
Yeah, we've got that, John. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay. So without further ado, welcome everyone. It's nice to see a lot of people on the call, and it's nice for me to recognise quite a few names on the call as well. So welcome to everyone. As Debra has said, this will be a quick run through where we are at currently with the transition project. So things have moved on in terms of data collection, statistics, numbers of laboratories, and and we are collating all of that as we go along. So this will be, some of you will have seen some of this material before at other talks that we've done around and about the country, and some of the slides may be familiar to you with other ones that you may have seen on previous webinars. So we'll move on now. First of all, just to give you a quick bit of background on 15189-2022, the UCAS process and the transition process. We will then have a look at a few aspects of the gap analysis form that we're requiring laboratories to complete for us, and that we will be adding to when we go on to visit you on site. Also, we'll have a look at some of the latest statistics and trends from the transition assessments, and key non-conformities that have been coming up as we've been collating a lot of that material. So hopefully everyone's aware of this, but just in case, and just in case you're quite new to quality management and you're quite new to ISO standards, 15189 has been revised. It was republished in December 2022, which for in time scales for us is an awful long time now. A lot of the ground has been covered. We've done a lot of training for our technical assessors and for our assessment teams. The revision process, it was led by ISO committee TC 212. And there is also a shadow committee of which Al Bryant and I are members, that are focused mainly for the United Kingdom, and also to have input into the international circles. The UK input was by both direct membership of TC212 and also via the Mirror Committee, which I've mentioned. There were some major changes that relate to a much bigger focus on clinical risk and also to patient impact, and of course the inclusion of point of care within the main body of 15189-2022, and also, as we'll see later in a second talk that we've got, the Annex A. So the publication, it kicked off a 3-year worldwide transition process that's managed in the UK by UCAS. So we had to develop a transition project. We've done many transitions before for other ISO standards, so we took a lot of the learning from that and put that together into how we were going to handle transition from 2012 to 22. So year one, which was last year, we issued a gap analysis. We did a lot of our assessor training. We also did a lot of customer education and awareness sessions in collaboration with the professional bodies. And those of you who have attended meetings throughout the UK have probably seen one or two of us maybe presenting in those sessions. So year two, we're in year two now, 2024. We have started in earnest with transition assessments and done many of those now. And we are progressing with those. A lot of them which have been done are within a decision-making process now. So we're working through that to get laboratories moved across to the new version. Next year, which is 2025, there will be grants of any remaining transitions, completion of any administration work that needs to be done, and also, in theory, allows us a buffer zone for any laboratories needing a second transition assessment, or there's any further work to do. So the key changes, in summary, is that it's patient focused. So that is stated right at the beginning of the document. The objective of the document is to promote the welfare of patients and satisfaction of the laboratory users through confidence in quality and competence of medical laboratories. So that spells out and sets the scene that it is patient focused now. It's also risk-based. This actually is derived from a couple of other support standards, ISO standards, 22367, medical laboratories application of risk management to medical laboratories, and 35001, which is biorisk management for laboratories and other related organizations. Now, we won't be assessing to those two, but we have in preparations and a lot of our talks that we do advise people that it's quite useful to actually, if you can get hold of copies of these, it gives a lot of extra support information. It helps you to understand some of the other terminology. And of course, finally, we've got 22870, which was the point of care adjunct standard, is now incorporated into 15189. So let's run through a few metrics. Approximately 700 laboratories to transition across. So that's quite a big amount of work to do. We've got approximately 170 assessors and decision makers trained and authorised now. So that includes healthcare staff and technical assessors. We have 36 months to complete it all. So the ultimate deadline that we're working towards, and this is a deadline throughout the whole of the world, is the 6th of December 2025, and that's when the 3-year transition period ends. After that date, accreditation to 15189 2012 and ISO 22870 2016 will cease to be valid. So again, hopefully everyone's aware of this, but just in case, follow the processes detailed in the UCAS technical bulletins, which are sent to all laboratories and published on the UCAS website, so they are still available there. Laboratories will complete a gap analysis, of which more later, and submit that to UCAS. So UCAS will assess the gap analysis and we'll follow up on any queries when we get on site. We are usually trying to combine these transition assessments together with any of your routine annual assessments. So we'll do the two exercises in conjunction. We found that works quite well, actually, because a lot of what you already do still applies to 2022. So there's a lot of crossover. If findings are raised, findings are raised, they're cleared, the laboratory is granted accreditation then to 15189 2022. And your 4-year accreditation cycle and your accreditation expiry date are unchanged because we're just transiting you across to a new version of the standard. So in more detail, you complete and return the gap analysis to us at least 1 month before the assessment date. That gives us time then to review that, annotate the form and identify any areas that we need to be followed up on the on-site assessment by the assessment manager or by the technical assessor. Findings may be raised during the on-site assessment, actions proposed by the customer as usual. So those processes in terms of the actual assessment is exactly the same. Following the on-site assessment, following documents will be issued. So whichever your routine assessment is, whether it's a surveillance or a reassessment, the IAR and the AR issued as normal. Obviously, we have now got the UCAS portal available. So those ones are issued via the assessment portal. However, to isolate the transition IAR and to make the admin a little bit easier for us, the transition findings we will be listing on the traditional old IAR form. So that only lists transition specific findings. The deadline for the evidence is still 1 month post-assessment. And the transition assessment report is actually the gap analysis form from each laboratory. And we have, those of you will have seen the gap analysis form will notice an extra column at the right-hand side of that. And that's where we add our comments on the conformance, non-conformance. We also provide an executive summary and a recommendation for transition at the end of that form. There is a usual UCAS decision-making process that is being followed, and when all the transition findings are closed and the final decision completed, the customer is then granted accreditation to 2022, and we will update your electronic certificate accordingly to register that new standard. So nearly 40 customers now have been granted accreditation so far to 15189. So we've got quite a way to go. Many more are in the decision-making process, and as a decision maker for UCAS, it's a daily look at that list, which is getting ever larger by day. So we are ploughing our way through those as quickly as we can. Over 80% of the transition assessments are now booked or have been performed. Transition assessments have generally gone quite well so far. However, we still find that some laboratory services are still unaware that a transition is taking place, which is quite surprising, really, but that's the way it is. Some lab services have not read the UCAS process timelines and think they can postpone the transition assessments until December 25. You will run out of time if you do that. And some lab services have not actually understood that the UCAS is assessing implementation of 15189 2022, not the intention to implement. So that's quite an important takeaway message for that. Okay, let's have a quick look at the gap analysis now. So UCAS accreditation, it's based on assessment of objective evidence to demonstrate that an organisation is competent and it complies with requirements of the relevant standard. So the technical bulletin, which was released in January last year, defines that the first step for any accredited customer is to identify gaps between the policies and processes that are currently in place compared to the requirements of 15189 2022, and then develop an action plan for implementing any of those new requirements. Also, customers shall provide UCAS with a completed gap analysis identifying those gaps and actions taken. Also, it's quite important as part of that to provide evidence, for example, updated documents, policies, records, etc., to actually demonstrate the actions that they have taken to comply with the new version. We then released, sorry, just moving on to, before I move on to the next slide, the gap analysis template. It's the responsibility of the laboratory to identify the changes between the standards. It's also important to actually determine the impact on those systems and then make and implement any required alterations as necessary. The submission of the gap analysis template, it should be supported by documentation that demonstrates how any new or changed requirements are met, and also the effective implementation will be assessed at the site visit, and that's where we get the opportunity to review any further evidence that that you might have, possibly since the gap analysis was completed, or that you've moved on further with projects that that you've initiated. So 1 month before the transition assessment, send in the gap analysis detailing any identified gaps and actions taken, and that will allow us time then to review things, to prepare any list of questions that we have or any other documentation that we might want to see when we come on site. We do expect you to have updated any relevant policies, procedures and SOPs, etc. by the time of the transition to demonstrate that the new version has been understood. So there should be evidence of the implementation of the new requirements and particular focus on the major changes between 2012 and 22. And that's actually identified and marked as which are the major changes that need more focus and more work on that form. So a couple of examples for you. This one, this was taken from a live gap analysis against 4.9, which is identification and control of non-conforming activity, and NCNs. So it is a major change. So we're expecting the laboratory to have implemented some processes in place to be able to complete those changes. So they provided some statements there of what they are intending to do, and also what they have completed as well. Now, SOP 1 was actually the audit SOP. It's also mentioned against other clauses, which is the audit clause, and not provided as evidence with the gap analysis. So a finding was raised as a major gap and no evidence of implementation. But SOP 2 was the SOP for identification and management of non-conforming activity. A policy was provided, so there was no finding raised as that policy had been updated. So that's one example there. If we look at another example, this one, they're listed again as a major gap. Then they have stated that there's no gap. The lab is listed a number of policies, including validation, verification, equipment management, and several policies relating to their limbs. No other policies or evidence was provided. So the UCAS assessor raised a finding, as this is a major gap and none of the policies assessed on site demonstrated compliance with 2022 requirements. So again, that's an example of where we would identify if there is a gap and something has not been done, then we would raise a finding against that. Another example against documentation of examination procedures. This is a minor, identified as a minor gap between the two versions. The lab listed a number of policies relating to document control and template and SOP templates. There was no other policies or no other evidence provided. So this was a minor gap and no change to laboratory processes. So no specific transition assessment was actually needed. The UCAS assessor commented on the structure, the content of the SOPs, and they commented that they were compliant with 2022. So no findings were raised from that. Okay. Third part of this presentation, we'll just look at some trends from transition assessments so far. So this was some statistics that we compiled through quartile 1 on identifying high-level trends, number of non-conformities raised against particular laboratory assessments, and also the clause header. So again, it's kind of sort of a league table then of the high level trends. If we look at in a little bit more detail at some of these, 7.3 is quite a large clause, so we found that it was useful to break down those into a little bit more detail. So under 7.3.7, we had about 128 non-conformities raised, ensuring the validity of results. And generally, the summary of findings was that there was no trend within a trend. Finding raised against lots of different aspects of that particular clause: lack of IQC at clinical decision limits, lack of documented justification of suitability VQA schemes, and lack of consideration of any third-party controls. Under 7.3.2, there were 34 non-conformities raised against verification of examination methods. And again, there was on that screen that table cell, a lack of clinical sign-off authorization, lack of competency assessment, authorization for performing verification, a lack of consideration of pertinent clinical decision-making in reports. So further on down, we had a breakdown of 6.2, identifying 62 non-conformances raised against 6.2.3. So that was against authorization, and 25 against 6.2.2 against competence requirements. So in summary there was just a lack of evidence of staff being trained, competency assessed, authorized to perform specific lab activities. 7.8, a breakdown of that showed 56 non-conformities raised against continuity and emergency preparedness. And again, that was just around the lack of evidence of testing for any continuity plans that laboratories have in place. Under 8.8, there were 47 non-conformities raised against 8.8.3 around internal audits. And this mainly focused on a lack of evidence of the risk-based approach to auditing. and both lack documented audit or documented policy and lack of risk-based audit schedules. So there may be some further, we will be constantly reviewing that and constantly collating data. So in further updates later on in the year, we'll be able to update that league table of findings just to see if there are any other trends or are the other trends developing. Just a few very quick statistics on quartile 2, as we haven't finished collating that data yet. Very quick review of findings. No particular order. Top 5 clauses that have findings raised against them listed there. And within 7.3, it's a very big clause with many subsections, as we've mentioned before. Mostly, again, are raised against 7.3.7 and 7.3.2, as in the previous slide. So, some take-home messages, really. The transition from 15189/2012 to 22 is actually live. It is happening. Please read the standard. Please read the information available that is on the UCAS website. Do complete your gap analysis in a timely manner to give us time to actually review that and to be able to then prepare either lists of questions or other documentation that we might need to see. And remember, when you're completing your gap analysis, that we do require supporting evidence of actual implementation, not a statement of intent. We cannot carry out your gap analysis whilst on site. It is your job, it's your responsibility to do your own gap analysis, it's your service, but we will review submitted form and evidence prior to your next annual assessment and will likely note any questions. And also, finally, remember that the deadline is the 6th of December 2025. That's what we're all working towards, and other accrediting bodies around the world are working to exactly the same deadline. Okay. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen now and come back to the main presentation.
Hey, John.
And back to you, Deborah.
Hi there. Thank you. That was great. It was good to see an update of where we're up to. And it's really, really useful for everyone on the call to understand where the common issues are against which of the clauses of the standards, so that they have a bit of a better understanding. If you have any questions for John at this stage on the transition to 2022, please pop them in the chat now and I'll pick those up, and then we'll move on to point of care in a minute. So John, your first question is from Jill. Apologies if I have misunderstood. Is it the lab's responsibility to identify the changes between the standards? Are UCAS not able to share the changes made to the standards? Wouldn't that ease the transition?
Okay, I'm just trying to find the question in the chat so that it saves you actually having to repeat the question again.
It's in the Q&A bit for you, John.
Okay, right. I'll just scroll that. Okay, that's interesting. I can't see it at the moment, actually.
Interesting. So I think the key thing for this one is, yes, there has already been work done by UCAS to identify the changes between the standards, hasn't there, John? So between 2012 and 2022, UCAS have done that piece of work around outlining what the major changes are. What John was talking about was then the gap analysis aspect of it, around how, as individual laboratories, we go about assessing those changes and the impact to our own services and understanding the gap between what we're currently doing to meet 2012 and then 2022. Would that be a fair reflection, John?
Yes, yeah, I found the question now. So yeah, it's I was looking at the wrong end of the Q&A list. So yes, Jill, on the gap analysis, Al Bryant did a lot of the work on that gap analysis form, and we did the work to actually identify where the gaps were and what were the major changes, the minor changes, what were the structural changes, and those are actually listed on that gap analysis form. So that bit of work has actually been done. So if you're focusing, when you're doing the gap analysis, if you're focusing firstly on those major changes and getting those all your ducks in order there for those, and then to move on to minor ones and to move on to structural changes. Certainly it's getting those major ones important, established and or processes in place and implemented for those to start with. So looking on that gap analysis form, they should be identified already.
That's great. Thanks, John. Nigel, I've made you a presenter, so would you like to unmute and stick your camera on? Because I know you've put a comment in the chat for John, sorry.
I am. It's just a comment really, John. It's a comment I've made several times over the last 18 months or so. People are still finding it very, very difficult in completing the the template of the gap analysis that you and the thing seems to have changed. Most people that I know have started with the standard, made a gap analysis between their system and the new standard, and then tried to interpret that in order to complete the gap analysis template that UCAS provided. Your gap analysis template, to my view and various other people, is completely the wrong way around. What people are trying to do is, as Jill kind of hinted at, was do a gap analysis between the old standard and the new standard, and that's not what's required. It's the gap analysis between the new standard and what you do, what your processes and policies should be in place. So they've made it a lot easier if you just got a template that was usable in the first place, and then you probably might not have got some of the issues that you've got. I mean, I talked about this at Congress 12 months ago, but nothing seemed to happen. So
okay. Well, comments accepted. I'll take those back to Al and to other people, and to see if there's any other ways that we can make the process a little bit easier. But what I would also say is that if you are having or experiencing any difficulties with these, the gap analysis form is to please talk to your assessment manager, who will be able to help you and try and support you with that. And if they can't, if they don't know the answer to the question, then they can escalate it back up the line to us as well to see if we can help.
So the biggest gap analysis that you can do is to write yourself a quality manual against the new standard. That would. It's a shame that the requirement for a quality manual was taken out of the standard, because that would have made life so much easier, in my view. But there you go. It is what it is. I think the standard's not the problem. It's people's trying to interpret how they're going to transition. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think what one comment that I would also make is that if you, the more you think about it, and the harder you think about it, sometimes the harder it gets. Because you can overthink things sometimes, which is why you focus on the majors first and get them right, and then other things then kind of hang off that then. So
that's great. Thanks, and thanks, Nigel, for putting that in. It's a really good point around what the gap analysis should be covering, as opposed to how some people have approached it.
Pretty much the only comment I've heard from people around the new standard, which is, it's pretty consistent and pretty much the only one as well.
Good.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks. No, it's absolutely fine. Thanks. We've also got a comment in the chat, John, from Kevin, and it's a really good one, actually, and one I haven't really thought about. But how do the non-conformance trends for the clauses to the new standards compare to the corresponding clauses in the old standards? Have we seen any similarities, or has there been any changes? Are the old problems still the old problems, I suppose, is the question.
We actually haven't done a comparison of data of findings from the old version to the new version, which might be an interesting exercise to do. But having said that, I would say that because of the similarities between 2012 and 22, and you are doing a lot of the processes which are the same or very similar, then I would expect that there are the trends are actually similar, and some of the old problems are still there. I think over the last few years, laboratories are getting a lot better at understanding things, but sometimes we do find some of the small basic things, and some things that you might find are I suppose maybe not petty findings, but some very small findings, and laboratories that are time pressured anyway sometimes have difficulties. And sometimes when you find that you're trying to run a service, some of your support things like your quality management system does tend to get pushed to one side, and training does tend to get pushed to one side sometimes. So yeah, appreciate it's difficult for laboratories.
I think it would be interesting to compare your league table that you just showed from the old trending to where we're at now. But I think we'll always see validation and verification top of the shop when it comes to things like that. So really interesting. Excellent. Thank you ever so much, folks. We'll move on to kind of the main bit of the event today, which is to talk about point of care testing and obviously withdrawal of 22870 and movement across to 15189. And it would be really lovely, John, if you could talk us through kind of where we're up to from that transition side of the process as well. Thank you.
Okay, right. I shall share my screen again. And just confirm you can see that presentation.
Yep, got that. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. So again, there's some of the material, you may have seen some of this material before in other presentations that I've done around and about. And some of it is some new material, some updated material as well. But this will focus really on an overview of point of care testing, where it fits in, how 22870 fits into things, and looking at some of the main changes. We'll look at Annex A and some of the support documents. So in this presentation, we'll look at the history, the definitions of it. We'll look at 2012 and 22870 and where that's at. We'll look at some of the other sources of support. We'll look at the main changes. We'll then look at 2022 and point of care and the aspects of that. We'll look at the clauses of Annex A. So if you are applying for point of care services, either as a new customer or you're looking to extend your scope to include point of care, then Annex A will be very important for you. We'll look at any of the support documents as well, and also some issues to consider for the future. So just a bit of a refresher on what point of care is. Quite a difficult definition to start with, and a lot of people got quite hung up about exactly what the definition was. I think it was clouded in the past by the American College of Pathology definitions of point of care, which was quite long-winded. So we tended to adopt the definition in 15189 2022, which under 3.22 it just states point of care testing is examination performed near or at the site of a patient. So that's a much more snappy definition. The source of that is also within ISO 22583, which is one of the support documents that we would recommend. Possibly it's useful to get hold of if you can get a hold of that to provide some extra background. So in the history of point of care and some of the impacts, there was generally quite a sporadic development of point of care, maybe over the last 10 to 15 years. That did lead to a lot of inconsistency in the types of service that were provided. It also led to a lot of inconsistency really in the ways that we could assess point of care. There were a lot of parallel or sometimes conflicting guidelines around and about, and that muddied the waters for people in their actual understanding of what they should be doing to provide an effective point of care service for patients. And the support for ISO 15189-2012, there was a lack of point of care uptake, and possibly because of all of the extra information that was around, the cloudiness of some of the information, a lot of people found it quite difficult to either find the resource or to be able to dedicate the time to apply 22870 to actually get their point of care service accredited. There was also issues with incorporation of lots of different services and different sites, whether you had primary or secondary care. And also there's some of the recent impacts that would refer to potentially the recent pandemic, COVID pandemic. A lot of private providers were setting up shop to provide point of care testing services for COVID. And again, that was a lot of extra work for UCAS to be able to try and support that. And if we move to the next slide, it just kind of gives an indication then that of where things were. There were 19 NHS trusts listed as having point of care as part of their CPA medical laboratory standards accreditation. So CPA had developed their own set of standards for point of care, and they were supposed to work in conjunction with the main CPA medical laboratory standards, so people could become accredited for that. Some then did not pursue 22870-2006 during the time of the CPA to 15189 transition. So that actually reduced the numbers to around about 12. And then transition from CPA to 15189-2012, only 4 then went on to include 22870-2016. I think that figure did go up by a couple of laboratories, but all the same, it's a very, very small number. So currently, though, there are still a very limited number of NHS organisations accredited for point of care. 4 organisations listed for COVID-19 point of care. There are 17 organisations listed for COVID-19 sampling, and at least 40 organisations, which the data for that was taken from 5 pages of the UCAS website search, those were listing COVID testing, although not point of care. There are a small number of private providers that are looking to expand their scopes as alternate sources of revenue after the fall off in COVID-19 point of care testing. Those scopes would include very limited biochemistry, hematology repertoires, very limited microbiology, serology repertoires, because if they've purchased a lot of equipment to do the point of care, to do COVID testing or to do wider COVID testing, then those analyzers would support the use for other things. So we have got some other private providers that are expanding to do other things, which is fine. So the main changes to note, the 3 significant changes there is that why 15189 was revised in the first place is it's an alignment to ISO 17025-2017. That then aligns 15189 as it was a bit of an outlier to the order of all other ISO standards. So those of you who are familiar with or work with other ISO standards will now see that 15189 is actually aligned in the order of all other ISO standards, which does make things a little bit easier. The inclusion of point of care testing is now brought into the main standard, so you will find reference to point of care all the way throughout 15189, and also the importance of risk management, because point of care by its nature does increase the risk to both to patients and also to the quality of the testing that is done by the nature of what it is. The emphasis generally is still overall the patient is the heart of the service, so it is patient focused. It's an integral part of 15189, and as such, all requirements apply for 15189. There is a normative annex, Annex A, which we'll come on to in a little while, that is specific to point of care, and that just highlights some extra things that any point of care service needs to consider if it is actually applying for an extension scope or it wishes to be accredited. A normative annex means that if point of care is included in the scope, then the requirement of that annex still has to apply. So that needs to be built into your quality management system to include point of care, and that you are meeting requirements of Annex A. So what parts of ISO 15189-2002 apply to point of care? The whole standard applies. To accredit to 22870-2016, compliance to 15189-2012 was required. And again, if we go back to CPA days, the CPA medical laboratory standards and then the point of care standards, the point of care standard was an adjunct to the main standard. So 22870 is an adjunct to 15189-2012. There are explicit and implicit requirements due to the objective of requirements being less prescriptive. So if we look at Annex A, in general, why Annex A? So this enables us to have some additional requirements for a laboratory for point of care that are quite distinct. So those requirements do specify laboratory's responsibility regarding the devices that are used for providing that service, the training of the personnel, which is important, even more so important in point of care services because of the variety of different staff, different personnel actually conducting those tests. The issues around quality assurance. Quality assurance is a little bit more challenging to deal with when it comes to point of care, especially if you have a very large point of care service. And also management review of the complete point of care process. So it's ensuring that you are incorporating point of care within your management review processes. Patient self-testing is excluded, but elements of the document may be applicable to that. And one very useful document, which is actually it's a guidance and support document, which is why it's called an ISO TS document 22583, guidance for supervisors and operators of point of care testing devices. That is a very useful document to have if you are operating a point of care service, because it gives you a lot of extra information in addition to the standard, and helps you to understand the rationale behind some of these things. So if we look at some individual aspects of Annex A, first of all, around the governance. So we've got the governing body of the organisation. They are ultimately responsible for ensuring that they have appropriate processes in place and also to monitor the accuracy and quality of point of care within that organisation. They might find it useful to have service agreements which ensure respective responsibilities, authorities are specified, and also communicated within the organisation. So that might be within the wider organisation, within the trust or the health board, or within laboratory services themselves, or within wards, departments, etc. Those agreements will have clinical approval, and also, where applicable, any financial approval around those. And also service agreements shall be with the point of care areas, and they may be managed via a health professional grouping. So the key word there is service agreements shall be with point of care areas. So that means that you have to have these service agreements in place, and that will then help to actually understand all of the processes, who does what, when and why, etc. But also that they may be managed via a health professional grouping. So the reason why that word may is highlighted there is because there is not a requirement to have a health professional grouping. It might be an advisory committee, a steering group now. But if you are managing a point of care service, you have those groups in place already, then it possibly would be quite foolish to actually disband them and say, well, we don't need them anymore. They are helpful. They are helpful for you to actually manage overall services. They're helpful to give you that clinical input. They're helpful to help possibly to get financial approval, and also to do maybe cost benefit analysis in terms of building up a point of care service, thinking about specific areas where there will be most benefit to have point of care, and some services where it may not be quite so beneficial. We have a quality assurance program in Annex A, so the important points around this is that the laboratory shall appoint a person with the appropriate training and experience to be responsible for point of care quality. So that might be if you have a point of care service that may be attached to, or it may be have connections with a laboratory service, it may tap in to that quality management system for the laboratory. It may use the same quality manager. It may use a quality management team with leads. But the main thing there is that there should be appropriate training and experience to be responsible for point of care quality. That does include review and conformity with the requirements of the document as related to point of care. There are some statements about training programs, and again, it's the person with appropriate training and experience appointed to manage training and competency assessment of personnel performing point of care. As I said in earlier slides, the nature and the risk of point of care services, because you have such a wide range of different staff performing point of care, that inherently increases the risks depending on the types of staff that are performing those. But it's important then that we've got the appropriate training there in place, we've got the appropriate experience for those people to be able to manage training and competency assessment of all of the personnel performing the point of care. So they then shall develop, implement and maintain an appropriate theoretical and practical training program. One of the key points around that is that it's important, if you are involved in any training for point of care, sometimes manufacturers will provide that training for you. If you're buying a large batch of new analyzers, new portable analyzers, maybe handheld devices, sometimes the manufacturer will offer that training as part of the package, as part of the deal. It is important, though, that the trainer is aware of whatever training is being delivered by a manufacturer, and that they have some input into that. There may be specific different requirements and specific training needs for different groups of staff. So the trainer needs to communicate with any external sources for training and make sure that that is actually appropriate, and it's appropriate to their particular local service. So what happened to 22870 2016? Well, the intention was always there to have point of care as part of the main standard. It was actually admitted from the 2003 version of 15189, and again from 15189 2012. So it seemed the perfect opportunity then, when we came to the 10-year point, to the review for the 2022, to actually bring 22870 into the mix of things. So that was an opportunity to remedy that. And also the fact that TS 22583 was actually released to provide the guidance for supervisors, operators of point of care devices. And again, that seemed a useful point to bring any of the extra information from those guidance into the main parts of the standard. So I'd mentioned there were some companion documents. So we have 22367, which is the application of risk management to medical laboratories. That's actually about to undergo another refresh due to the numerous links to the old version of 15189. So that work is in progress at the moment. We've also got 20914, which is a guidance for the estimation of measurement uncertainty. That again is out for review, but there's a very clear steer that has been sent that it should actually not be revised, that the document is still fit for purpose. And we've got 1519 now, which is the medical laboratories requirement for safety. That's a very useful document to read and understand, because it covers many of the concepts that the new standard 15189 does not go into detail about. So all of those things are actually relevant to support point of care services. So if we look at some of the key points around 22583, so that is the document. Again, it's available from BSI, as all of our standards are. It's not a full standard. It's a technical specification, which is what the TS stands for. It's far less prescriptive than a full standard. So it does provide guidance, it does provide direction, a little bit of steer for the reader, and helps them to understand things a little bit better. It also gives some guidance for any of the supervisors, operators of point of care, where it's performed without medical laboratory training, supervision or support. For instance, you may have ward staff, you may have healthcare workers, healthcare support workers carrying out point of care testing on the wards, the various delivery points, the clusters. It includes the key components that need to be considered to provide any safe, reliable point of care results. It's also been written in a non-scientific style to actually make it much more relevant to a reader who may be involved with the delivery of a point of care service. So it makes it easier for them to understand. I think that slide says the same thing. I should have taken that out actually. Focus on thinking about point of care as just another service or another discipline. With the removal of some of the challenges that prevented organizations applying. So one of the challenges that people did find was trying to organize committees, trying to get steering groups together from a variety of different groups or different directorates within trusts or health boards, and that a lot of people found that quite challenging. So that was quite a hurdle for some people to provide to meet requirements of 22870. It may make point of care within a little bit more reach of a lot more laboratories. So we're hoping that there's going to be a lot more uptake. We're hoping that with 228 with 15189 2022, that laboratories who are maybe supporting point of care services or even standalone point of care services will think about accreditation for that. So this document, it also provides support for both the UCAS staff and the contracted assessors when assessing organizations applying for point of care as part of their scopes. So a training and awareness of 22583, that is actually considered around sort of the layout of the document, what to do, how to think about applying 22583, and that does help a lot of the assessment teams. It may help laboratories actually when they're thinking about applying for accreditation. There's always an expectation that accrediting service or laboratories will be aware of and have available within their external document management system any of the support documents such as 22583, and also training and awareness of 22583 by the point of care teams to all of the operators, providers of point of care. So that then helps them to build up their understanding of why they do what they have to do, why they're following certain SOPs, certain procedures, why they have to follow certain processes, and understanding all of the quality assurance aspects and why that is very important, even in point of care. We also expect that there will be inclusion of any guidance documentation within UCAS documents, i.e. the gap analysis for applicants transitioning, and also to extend the scope to include point of care. Also support documents for technical assessors, assessment report guidance, that also is quite useful for assessors when they're actually producing reports for us after doing the assessing. So point of care with together with 15189 2022, there are a lot of other aspects of 15189 2022 that will require assessment if point of care is being included. So those are listed on the next screen. So there are various aspects of that, a lot of which you would already do in your laboratory service. So again, it's thinking about how you apply all of these things to the point of care service. So again, for those of you involved in quality, involved actually working on the bench in the laboratories, that may not be of any surprises to you that that we will be looking at those particular areas. So looking to the future then, we will see, or we're hoping to see, a large increase in the applications for extensions to scope to include point of care, or even new applications for point of care services. So a lot of work is going on now and discussions around the networks. We've got the, as Debra mentioned it right at the start, we've got the release of the National Strategic Guidance for point of care, point of need testing. We've also got various articles and publications in the Biomedical Scientists. We've certainly presented to point of care innovators before, and also the ACBLM. Revision of overall care pathways for patient diagnosis and treatment in the NHS, that is becoming much more important now, because of the stresses, the pressures upon the NHS, getting people out of hospitals back into the community, or even trying to treat them in the community, and thus preventing them from the need to go into hospital in the first place. We are actively engaged with discussions with professional bodies on the future point of care service delivery, but in some of those work streams that it's early days, so that hopefully will lead on to a few comments that Debra might make and update us on some of that work that is going on. Okay, so that's a quick whistle-stop tour of how point of care fits in with the overall picture of 15189. So I shall stop sharing my screen and come back to the main room.
Brilliant. Thank you, John, and thank you for that guided walkthrough of 15189 for point of care. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A bit, which I'll come to in a second, but really from my point of view, I would hope that bringing point of care into the main standard around 15189 and something that we're probably a little more familiar with from a laboratory service provision, I would hope that increases the number of applications that you see now for point of care, because it is still disappointingly low around accreditation, isn't it?
It is, yes, it is. And it always has been, and it amazed me that even back in CPA days, there wasn't that much uptake. And maybe it goes back to sort of an earlier comment, sort of responding to Nigel, that perhaps people are overthinking things and thinking, God, this is far too difficult for me to do. Haven't got the resource to dedicate to this. But hopefully now it's within 15189, it will make things easier for people.
Fabulous. There's 2 or 3 questions from John in the Q&A. I think the first 2 that you've covered around number of services accredited and pulling the 2 standards into one. So if we can just look at, is the addition of point of care services to an existing all pathology accreditation an extension to scope or a new application?
Okay, so if you have if you are operating point of care services, or it's maybe you treat it as a separate section of your laboratory services, and you're wanting to apply for point of care, then that would be classed as an extension to scope. But have a discussion with your assessment manager on exactly what your service entitles and how that works. But certainly it looks like, I think from your question, it would be an extension to scope.
That's great, thank you. There's a couple of questions from Helen, and Helen's on our quality specialty advisory panel. Helen, would you like to unmute and take your put your camera on so you can ask your questions?
Hi John, hi Debra. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, just a couple of questions. So first one that links to what you were just saying actually about extension to scope. So at the moment for our labs we have discipline specific accreditation, but when I've looked at the scopes on the UCAS website that have accreditation for point of care testing, they appear to be labs that have multidisciplinary accreditation already, so they've applied for accreditation as a single laboratory. So would you recommend that that's the best way forward for point of care if you have already amalgamated your labs under one accreditation heading, or can point of care testing sit under a particular discipline? So you could put your blood gas analysis and glucose meters under your chemistry accreditation, put HIV testing, etc., under your infection and immunity sciences accreditation.
Yeah, that's it's a good question, that, and it actually links to some of the work that we are doing at the moment around schedules and the way that schedules will appear, how we can present them, and how we can make it easier for users to actually see what a laboratory is accredited for, because the schedule document, it's in the public domain. Anyone can search. The current schedule, if you are, but believe me, as a decision maker, as having been an assessment manager, trying to change somebody's schedule and add extra things is quite a nightmare on the existing documentation. So hopefully we'll be making that easier. The way that point of care tests would be displayed in a schedule, because it's all part of the same standard now. In the past, there have been various different ways of displaying point of care testing. A lot of people have either put Excel spreadsheets, or they put tables at the bottom of their schedules displaying what their testing, their point of care was. But as it's part of the main standard now and the main schedule, there would be no difficulties in adding your point of care tests under whichever discipline they're relevant to. For instance, in the blood gas analysis would sit under biochemistry. Some of the hematology analyzers would sit under hematology scopes, and that would also be defined, and it will be quite clear that it would be you would need to also specify in some way where the locations of those pieces of kit are where they're situated. So that might mean some extra work to do, either in displaying as an appendix or something else around the schedule, so that we knew exactly where all of these things were, and we knew the numbers of documents. But the main test would sit under whichever discipline it was. So that's, I think, it's work in progress for us as the schedule project develops, as to how that can be tested. If you go onto the UCAS website and search for laboratories who are accredited to point of care now, you'll see there are differences in the ways that these things are actually displayed at the moment.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that's what I've done, is gone and had a look, and the two that I looked up are both multidisciplinary. That's why I thought it would be interesting to find out if there's a recommendation to go one way or the other. Yeah. The other question that I had was, from your experience, really, what have been the biggest obstacles for labs who are accredited to ISO 15189, are quite used to that and want to now bring in point of care testing? Where have you got any foresight about the blockers that people usually see? For me, I've worked in point of care before, and it's really the having to get non-scientific staff to think about the piece of equipment as scientific piece of equipment, and be able to have that sort of control over training, etc., for non-qualified or non-scientific staff. But from your opinion, what would be the biggest obstacles for trying to get that accreditation?
Yeah, from my experiences of assessing point of care services so far, I've been involved with a couple of customers where I've either directly assessed or been involved with other assessment managers assessing those. Training of non-clinical staff, non-medical staff, non-scientific staff is quite an issue. But then again, that's why you have your training and your competency responsibilities, and you have the people there to be able to lead and guide and instruct on how that's to be delivered. Doesn't necessarily have to be delivered by a training officer, or it could be delivered by a link nurse, it could be delivered by a service manager, but there has to be that input there. The other thing that is quite difficult, again, if you're of a non-scientific background, is to understand the reasons why we have to do quality assurance. And again, those processes of establishing your EQA processes, establishing an effective IQC process for all of your point of care devices, that can be quite a challenge to manage. some laboratories, as I've alluded to in the slides, find it quite difficult in terms of where they were trying to set up steering groups, committees. That wasn't happening. So they decided, well, if we can't meet that part of 22870, well, we're on a non-starter there, so we need to think of other ways of doing that. So hopefully that will make it easier. One of the other things that is quite a challenge, I think that will still be a challenge, is around the legal entity, because if you have primary versus secondary services for point of care, if you have point of care out in the community run by or led by GP services, and you have large groups of GPs, you still have to have one legal entity which actually carries the responsibility for that entire point of care service, and trying to persuade trusts to take that on and take on responsibilities for primary care is quite a challenge. So some laboratories have, or some point of care services have decided, okay, well, for now, what we'll do is we'll get internal point of care accredited. We'll leave the community based and think more carefully about how we're going to manage that.
I think generally a phased approach to accrediting point of care is a well-trodden path, isn't it?
Yeah.
Instead of going big bang across all devices in all settings, start small and don't overthink it. Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Helen. Jonathan sat beside me, hasn't put a question in the chat, but I know he's desperate to ask a couple of things. Go for it.
I wouldn't expect anything else, Jonathan.
Hello, John.
Hello.
Talking about overthinking things.
Yeah.
Just when you're saying about, like, because obviously everyone's got the framework of 15189, and hopefully we're all accredited and things are ticking over. We are not accredited for point of care, and I have many fears of which things like training and competence, evidence and that. So when we're getting assessed, so at the minute we have to do training and then separately competency assess people, and we have to demonstrate that they've been effectively two separate sort of entities as part of our laboratory training competence. That will not exist outside. What will happen is we get a whole new intake of junior doctors, for example. They get collared in their training and just get banged through going, right, this is how you use this, and then get signed off on documentation that we wouldn't normally use because it won't be as extensive and have all that sort of information in. So my worry is that if I tried, we'd be in a perpetual loop of the same findings over and over again, that not everybody there's trained, sharing of barcodes and things like that, all this bad practice. We'll try our best to stamp out. You already mentioned about IQC, EQA, we send it out, then they don't do it. So we raise CAPAs, but monitor the ones we can. And I just have an endless fear, and probably which is why I don't push it too hard at the minute. Ironically, the setting up the committee's been an easier thing. But I don't know what you think, because I just have a lot of worries about things like that. And then when you mention accommodation and environment, and I think we've got 280 glucose meters sitting in 280 different locations.
Yeah. How
much is that going to cost me to get a technical assessor out who's going to do some of them, but they're going to have to travel, our trust up in Northumberland, so there's 60 miles between two sites if they go to Berwick, and I have a financial concern as well. So
well, they could always hitch a ride on one of your drones.
They can try.
I can understand your fears, and it's for a large community-based service, it can be difficult. In terms of getting assessment teams out, you're obviously aware of how we would sort of ration out the sampling of these over the 4-year cycle. So we would have a fairly robust way of doing that, so that we wouldn't sort of be travelling, say, to one end of the country at the Scottish borders, right across to the other end in the middle of the Pennines, and try and do all that at the same time, because that would be a waste of resource. For the aspects of the record keeping, for training, those sorts of things, trying to keep things, if you can try and manage things centrally, seen some good examples of where all of the training, the competence records, the quality assurance is maintained centrally by the point of care office or the team. That makes things easy. Having point of care coordinators that are regularly visiting these sites and just banging the drum and saying, where's your documentation for that? Have you done your temperature monitoring for this? And just keep at them constantly. That's a way of doing it.
I think just with that temperature, because just when I said about temperature monitoring, I mean, obviously we use a temperature monitoring system in the laboratory. There is nothing out in the ward lands. So and I suspect that most of the wards are too hot probably half the time, because they seem to like to run the wards at about 35 degrees to cook everybody. So my fear is then, how would we then have to manage every location?
Well, in wards in the summer, so there's a tendency sometimes to do these things in the sluice rooms. That's where I've found a lot of point of care services based, and that's where they keep all of their ambient temperature reagents on the bench, sitting there frying in the summer. So having maximum minimum thermometers is maybe one thing to do, or getting in touch with the estates departments, finding out how they monitor temperature, and then trying to tap into their records. But some of the simpler approaches I've seen is the maximum minimum thermometers, but then you've got to make sure that people actually read them and record them.
And they're calibrated to 70025.
And also if they're out of range, what do you do about it? They then have to understand what they're going to do.
It's all right, John, you've put me off. We're not doing it.
Jonathan, you know you're up for a challenge, and we've got a really well-established point of care team. So yes, it's definitely possible.
Who's your assessment manager now?
Scott Mullane.
Okay, I'll push Scott hard then.
And I'll push him out.
Brilliant. There is a question in the chat just from Jill, and I know she just put her hand up briefly there as well. So in terms of access to reference documents, when we're running a 4 acute service, how do you purchase ISO standards and technical specifications, or can we purchase ones for the network? It's the age-old copyright question.
It's the copyright question. We would put me on the spot here, and trying to be independent as UCAS has to be here. I think the arrangement would entirely be for you and BSI and ISO as to how you actually manage that. Right at the start, we did have situations where sort of a laboratory would purchase a single copy, then they'd go and photocopy it and distribute it around all over the place. Or sometimes they'd acquire a copy by various means on the World Wide Web and use that. But I think the arrangement would have to be, you'd have to talk to BSI to how you actually use those things. If you've got a network of 4 acute trusts, it's dependent on where you're actually going to lodge your copy. If it's an electronic copy, whether you lodge that copy on your document management system for people to access and then control that access, so you have a list of who can actually see those documents. But again, speak to BSI about how the best way of doing that. I'm not sure what kind of answer that they might give. They might say, well, you need to purchase loads of copies and then we'll make lots more money. But
yeah, absolutely, John. So this one isn't really, Jill, this one isn't really a UCAS question, it's a BSI question, and it's one that does come up, isn't it? Because to be able to comply with standards, you need to be able to read it, but to be able to read it, you have to purchase it. So yeah, it goes on and on, but electronic versions of the document are available. And I think John's right. Have a conversation with the team at BSI. They are more attuned to network ways of working now and how you can go through the different purchase options. So I think that's kind of the first point of contact, really. Right, we're going to do one last quick one, then I'm going to briefly tell you a little bit about the document that John mentioned, and then we'll wrap it up. So do you know if CQC will look to include point of care accreditation as part of the audit with respect to patient safety?
Again, that's a new question for me. We are starting to talk to CQC, and it's a pity that my colleague Al Bryant is not here, because she's the main link person for any other external stakeholders that UCAS has to talk to people. Certainly, if UCAS, my experiences in the past of CQC in the last centuries when I was quality manager, did have dealings with CQC, they tended to only be interested in certain things like infection control and nothing else. And if a laboratory service was accredited, they didn't seem to have very much interest in it. They just took it as read that that was fine. If CQC are modifying the way that they actually assess any services now, I would not be surprised if they would include point of care as part of their audit, because of the link and the emphasis on patient safety now. And obviously with CQC teams, they are very much focused on patient, the patient service and how the trusts deliver the patient safety. Not sure. I'm trying to avoid the UCAS response of saying it depends, but I might have to use that.
Oh, we can't get through a whole UCAS session without saying it depends, John. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things now where we're starting to see crossover into CQC, and traditionally we've had that kind of memorandum of understanding way of working around CQC not crossing into where UCAS covered and vice versa. But obviously the NHSE guidance around the blood culture pathway has blurred those lines for some other areas, and this may be another key area that will be the same. Nigel, I'm going to give you 30 seconds.
Just to answer that question a bit more, because I'm a laboratory specialist with CQC.
There you go then.
So CQC would only look at the laboratories if they came across an issue with the laboratories. They generally tend to leave it to UCAS to do the assessment. So I don't think POCT accreditation will impact on CQC audit, unless there's been some incidents and problems with the service that people are complaining about, or patients are complaining about particularly. It tends to focus on patient satisfaction more than in terms of their quality agenda, rather than getting the right answer at the right time. So it probably have very little impact, to be honest, whether you're accredited to, whether your POCT is accredited or not.
Yeah. Okie doke. Thank you, Nigel. That's really helpful. Okay, so just to wrap up, and I'm just going to share my screen again. It's been mentioned a couple of times today, and really just to raise awareness of the point of care strategy document that I mentioned at the beginning, and John's also referenced today. So this was the document that we worked on at IBMS alongside the Royal College and the ALM. And really outlines the strategic requirements to adopt a point of care service that delivers that safe, high quality service that we all need. There are 11 recommendations in that document, and if you are trying to ensure your service is resilient, or indeed grow your service further, it's a fantastic document to put in front of key stakeholders to ensure that you have the necessary support and resource to grow your service as much as possible. We were commissioned by NHS England to write that, and obviously point of care continues to be a key work stream for NHSE and across the other home nations as well. And really we want to be able to ensure that we accelerate the adoption of point of care. We understand that testing outside of the traditional laboratory setting is now the norm, but we have to ensure that it is that safe, high quality service. Having that framework around digital provision and ensuring results are digitally managed, ensuring the quality of the service, and obviously 15189 is absolutely integral to that. Ensuring value for money, because we know point of care is often significantly more expensive than the laboratory equivalent. And finally, our workforce provision and ensuring resilience in our workforce. All of those key things are all aspects of the work stream that NHSE are currently working on, and we continue to support as part of the National Pathology Stakeholder Group. So that's really important. A couple of final resources for you. I'd get told off if I didn't point out the biomedical scientist, and these are just some of the articles that we've released around the new standard, and obviously one there specifically around point of care testing and transition to 15189. And as usual, please remember, read the standard, do your gap analysis, and use the support available to you. We are really keen to hear if you found some of this series helpful, what else you would like us to support you with over the coming weeks and months as we move towards the 6th of December 2025, which is getting ever closer now, John, really, isn't it? It's not going to be long till we get there now.
Yes, yes.
But for today, huge thank you, John, for joining us. Coverage of that point of care stuff has been hugely, hugely helpful. I hope our audience have found it useful today, but thank you ever so much for taking the time to join us. Take care, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.